Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Enabling Performance in Today's Dynamic Workforce. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst at Brandon Hall Group, and Debbie Gower. Debbie is the Senior Director at Conduent, supporting learning services and solutions, strategic communications, and change management offerings. I would like to extend a thank you to Conduent for sponsoring today's webinar. On this next slide, Conduent delivers mission-critical services and solutions on behalf of businesses and governments, creating exceptional outcomes for our clients and the millions of people who count on them. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that our Technology Awards program is now open for submissions, and we have added multiple categories across our program areas. So please be sure to visit our main website for the latest. Next, your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components for our research. If you see any surveys on our schedule that you'd like to participate in, it is always greatly appreciated. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. You can also visit our website and click on Open Surveys for that latest list. And finally, a few logistics. This presentation is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar via a follow-up email. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing it into the question box for our presenters. And finally, if you would like to download a copy of the presentation instantly, you may do so by finding it in the handout section on your control panel. And without further delay, I will hand things over to Dave to kick us off with our agenda.
Great, thank you, Melissa. And I encourage folks to take advantage of that question box. If you do have any questions for Deb or myself as we go through, feel free to ask. We'll try to get to them in relevant questions in real time. We'll also have a little bit of time at the end to answer any remaining questions, but yeah, that's the way you're going to communicate with us, so please take advantage of that. So today we're going to walk through this idea of a unified workforce strategy and talk through some of the key drivers and enablers. And we're also going to explore not only Brandon Hall Group's research, but Conduent's research in this area around what successful workforce enablement methods are. And then we're going to sort of wrap up by going through some considerations and strategies for supporting and building a performance-based strategy that has proven business impact. So with that, I think we need to start off with sort of a bigger picture of what we're all facing, right? And I think, if you looked around today and you had conversations, which many of you have been having with people about the business world today, what we're all facing, what we're seeing, I think your mind would look a little bit like this as far as a word cloud goes, right? So the larger the words, the phrase, the more likely we're going to come across that as a topic of conversation. So clearly, remote work is a big topic currently right now, but I also, and we've seen this in our research, that not necessarily pandemic driven, but we see a lot more discussion around diversity and the demographic change of the workforce. As we get through the pandemic, there's going to be a focus on reboarding. There's a lot more going on in the areas of things like automation. And of course, companies, having been forced to deal with remote work and managing remote teams over the last year and a half or so, in that transition, they're re-envisioning what the workplace really is going to look like in the future. So, I know, Deb, in your conversations with folks, this is sort of what bubbles up to the surface as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave, and thanks for that. It's kind of an overview of what we're all living in. So, if this is the big business world, what happens at an individual level? I mean, you look at these little bubbles that have now popped up, and I feel pretty confident that every single person on this call, including myself, including Dave, has experienced each one of these at one point or another. And so, what do you do? I mean, we're in a situation, we're in a world, and we have been for, 2 decades probably, where change is just ever present. The difficulty right now is that it is such that the breadth and the depth of the changes continue to grow and expand. And so how do you deal with all of that? If you're a leader of an organization, how is it that you start figuring out how to put the right kind of strategies in place in order to enable the workforce to be able to perform so that they can achieve the kind of business impact that all the leaders desire for the organization. So Dave, as we look at these dynamics that are going on around us, Brandon Hall's done a survey and has come up with some of these strategies that are starting to emerge.
Yeah, and so that very specific concept of the workplace dynamic itself has changed. How are companies going to be addressing that as people come back to work? And one thing I've seen, just like anything that has generated out of this pandemic environment, it continues to shift and to change. And we've been trying to follow this through a research standpoint since March of last year. Right? We've been tracking what company, how they were reacting early on, what their transitions were like, and then what's their focus moving forward when they see themselves on the other side of whatever this is. And it's shifted tremendously in that initially, once remote work became normal, I think the estimations of what the return to work would look like were vastly different than they are today. I think there was this expectation that almost no one was going to come back, right? And then suddenly we realized, no, okay, it turns out most people are probably going to come back to the workplace. But what does that actually look like, right? It's not exactly going to be the way it was before. There will still be a larger portion of the workforce that's remote than previously, and we'll see that in a second. But the idea is, okay, what are the things that we're after? And so how are we adjusting? And you see companies are wrestling with things like, okay, what's the flexible scheduling between on-site and off-site? Do we, set a schedule? How do we approach this? We give people, the opportunity to sort of pick and choose more ad hoc. 76% believe that that's going to be the approach, is this more flexible approach to allow for that balance in things like homeschooling, childcare, and things like that. You also see 44% say they're going to look at alternating days in the office or in the plant. So how do we can have people maybe do every other day or whatever that schedule looks like. Split shifting, alternating weeks, not days. Only 8% say they're not considering any of these alternatives. So what this says is, whatever it was you were doing a year and a half ago, you're not going to be doing it that way going forward. And we need to adjust our perceptions on it. Isn't just about when does somebody clock in or clock out, right? It's how do we now address all of the different experiences they have as part of work to address how they're actually working, right? The whole idea of the quote unquote workplace has been blown up. There isn't necessarily a workplace for a lot of people. And so how are we going to adjust to meet those needs in that new dynamic? And, on the next one, Debbie, like I mentioned, I think the original estimations are softening a bit as there seems to be definitely on the corporate side, the organizational side, there's a definite hunger for people to come back to the office. Maybe not so much on the workforce side, but I think in general, people do want to and will to some degree. But like I said, what does that look like? No one's really sure right now. They're still trying to figure out what works because they haven't done it before. And I think the key thing that you mentioned, Debbie, is that idea of the breadth and the depth of the change. And I've been saying this for a while, that to me, that's one of the sort of silver linings in this whole thing, is that this has really opened organizations' eyes to what change really means. They've been talking about it for years. We have to be ready for a VUCA world, but their idea of what that is was not what happened. And so it's really expanded their perceptions and their idea of what change readiness really means.
Yeah, it's the combination of the perceptions about what it is, but then, you look at last year, the reality smacked you upside the head with having to do something about it. And, I still look back and I ask myself every now and then, did that really happen? And of course it did. But, and of course, organizations around the world reacted, and many of them made it. Some of them are better. Some didn't. And, being able to adapt to change, where you have this adaptive change going on, you need an adaptive response as well. So I think much more time and attention will be spent on that.
For sure.
Okay, so we've talked about some of these big picture items. So I'm going to take all of you back to the latter part of 2019. And we at Conduent started having some observations. And the observations centered around the fact that, for decades and decades, those of us in the, particularly in the learning community, are not unfamiliar with the fact that there's been a tight linkage between what happens with learning and what happens with that integration of your knowledge databases and managing knowledge and what have you. That those have been there was a convergence there many years ago. However, what we started to see was an additional convergence, not just with those two sources of content, and by content I mean broadly, I'm defining any kind of information broadly as content, but other sources were starting to emerge. Internal communication, so think about anything going out to the entire workforce, and I'll come back around to explain to you why I'm intentionally using the word workforce. Internal marketing, that may have you scratch your head a bit, but think about anytime you have a new product or service or an enhancement or some sort of a significant change, it's as important that internally from within the organization, you understand what that is, what that means, particularly if it affects what you do on a day-to-day basis, as it is for any sort of external marketing. And then, lastly, your policies and governance, where your SOPs and other compliance data, and that's it. There's been somewhat of a linkage there. But what we started seeing was the fact that all 5 of these sources of content were starting to converge. So why is that? Well, you've got the drivers behind the fact that when Amazon became as significant to all of us as it is, you saw the consumer experience and expectations of it bleed into the workplace. Everyone and their brother right now has not gone more than a week without seeing some reference to the need to fill skills gap or upskilling or reskilling or some other sort of reference. Content overload. One of my favorite people calls it content chaos. There's just too much, and what in that content is actually relevant to what you need to know and do something with. The operating model adjustments that have been ongoing for a long time, but certainly punctuated by last year with everybody needing to go virtual, and organizations, as Dave was just talking about, some may choose to stay virtual because they've figured out that it works for them. Many others will adopt more of a hybrid approach in one way, shape, or form. I think it would surprise me if every organization or a significant percentage of organizations did go back completely to the way they were before the pandemic hit. But time will tell on that. And then, the last 2 I think are kind of intuitive around every company is trying to make sure that they are differentiated from a marketplace perspective and is able to, as I was saying before, adaptive changes that comes along, that they have an adaptive response to it. So what can we do? How do we enable all of these drivers behind what's happening? We do it with workforce self-sufficiency. And I'm intentionally using self-sufficiency versus self-service. When self-service first became popular in about the mid-90s, it had a pretty negative connotation, because generally what it meant then is that someone who used to do something for me is no longer going to do it, and it's going to be expected for me to do in a self-service kind of a way. And so that kind of left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. We've gotten a lot more used to it, since the mid-90s. But by self-sufficiency, I mean being able to do what you want to do, when you want to do it, and how you want to do it. So it becomes a little bit more palatable. Obviously, everything we're talking about, you need to deal with technology enablement. Content, not all content needs to be created new. You look at those 5 sources, and what I'm talking about largely is curating from them, from existing content. So pulling together functional groups within an organization who used to be siloed, and curating, organizing, integrating across, so that we are making sure that the right information is available at the right time, the way our workers need it. then the optimization I've just spoken to, and then the ongoing critical importance of change leadership in addition to change management. So we took all of this and said, let's test it. Let's see what our observations look like, because we believe that all of these things that I just talked about are necessary in order to enable a workforce to perform. So we teamed with the training industry and conducted a joint study. And the basic question that all of the survey participants received, you'll see on this slide. We're talking about any type of interaction or communication that is necessary to support job performance. So we asked a lot of questions. I'm going to show you some data shortly about what that meant to an organization, what they identified with and what they've done with it, and what some of the outcomes were. So here was the first result. What you'll see by virtue of the dark and light blue bars is that with this study, and it was a credible study, it was well over 300 participants crossing various industries, a good distribution of level of respondents, good distribution of size. So we really felt we got a good point of view coming in from many organizations. Where you see those dark blue and light blue bars that are identified as high revenue growth and negative revenue growth, what we asked is for each participant to self-identify organizationally how their companies were performing over the past 5 years. So this study was actually conducted in spring of 2020. So it immediately followed the quarantining that we were probably all still under at the time. But we did a 5-year look back. And what's important about this is that we asked the participants, are you trying to manage enabling your workforce? And are you doing so successfully? And you'll see, probably no big surprise to many of you, that the companies that are performing well far outweigh the number of companies who are not performing well by saying they always pay attention to enabling the workforce. There's a major drop-off. You see that most of the companies who are doing well are putting all their time and attention into doing it, into trying to have some structure. You're not seeing anywhere near the same kind of distribution from a negative growth perspective. So then we looked at, okay, if you're paying attention to it, if you're doing something intentionally, are you trying to do it in a unified way? So that would be integrating across multiple sources of information via multiple means, what have you. And another very telling outcome on this slide. For the companies who are offering this unified experience, 62% of them were high performing versus only 11% that were negative, where it was probably happening more incidentally than not. And you've got to go all the way back, for those companies that aren't doing nearly as well, most of them are sitting in the bottom half, not in the top half. Whereas, the converse of that is true for the high performing companies. The next thing we did was to find out, and remember those 5 sources of content that I mentioned, are you using all of these? Is this something in your intentional effort to try to unify, are you tapping into all of these sources to enable the workforce? Again, I don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this slide. I think the outcomes for those companies who are doing it well and seeing the business impacts, positive business impacts from it, are pretty telling. Where I do want to point out, though, is that the bar that has the highest percentage for companies that are not doing as well from a business metric perspective, particularly revenue, most of them, where they did pay attention to using a source, it fell into policy. So you remember, that's policy, governance, SOPs, compliance. Having nothing but a compliance focus is not sufficient to enable a workforce in order to perform the way that you need them to perform to achieve business impact.
You know, Deb, let me ask a question that came from the group,
Yeah.
because you were talking about, you know, high-performing companies and them managing employee enablement successfully. So Melanie asked actually, I think it's an interesting question, is has the scope of what enabling the workforce means, you know, what that is, has that scope changed over time in understanding by leadership? And if that's true, then does that skew the results over time as well?
Well, okay, so I think we would have had different responses if we had conducted the survey 5 years ago.
Right.
What I think, here's I hope I'm interpreting the question correctly. So, you know, please bounce back in the chat space to Dave if I'm not. But where I think the difference is now, when you look across all of these sources, in the past, and well, even currently, there are different functional owners of these sources of content. And where companies keep that content very siloed and don't look at it as being an enabler and look at it as trying to integrate it in a way that really connects directly with the work that needs to be performed in a very relevant way, I think that that's probably the biggest difference that I think we would see now as compared to before. Did that make sense? What I just explained? I think now there's much more integration versus the siloing.
Right. No, and I would agree with that, and I think that does make sense. I'll leave it to Melody if she wants to put in the question box whether we hit the mark or not on her question, but I think the way you've interpreted it makes sense to me.
Okay, so let's go to the next question. So then we did want to do, so instead of that kind of backward look, we're going to do a forward look. And we asked the high performing companies, you know, what are you doing next? Well, we asked all companies, what are you doing next? And the high performing companies are touching on, you know, multiple impacts to strategy and you know, practical tactical efforts and what have you. And I think what's important to me here is if you look at about 2/3 the way over, the highest bar for the high growth companies, designing strategic plans with flexibility. Again, that gets back to what I was talking about before with, you know, the fact that change is ever present, and so we need adaptive response to it. Where I think it's interesting is that the companies that aren't doing as well is that, you know, they're really just kind of starting to figure out. The highest response rate there was the 60% in the second group of bars on enduring constant change. And so, you know, they're playing a little catch up from behind in maybe a little bit different way than some of the companies who are high performing, where it is an area of focus, but they're able to start looking beyond just that as being a top concern. And then the last data point I'll share with you, that, you know, this is the one, the business impacts. What this is trying to show is that if you look across key business metrics like revenue, market share, profitability, companies who are offering this unified experience where they're integrating and coordinating their sources of content, their efforts, are outperforming the companies who are not providing this unified experience, but are doing things in a disjointed fashion. And then, you know, beyond just the pure business metrics, you get into those things that are important to really every leader of a company, and that, you know, has to do with the satisfaction of your workforce as well as the retention. So when we looked at all of the data, and I'm just showing you some select data from the study, this was the one that kind of brought it all together to say, this approach does seem to make sense. There's enough of a differential between companies that are performing well and what they're doing, what they're focused on, how they're doing it, compared to those companies that are not performing at the same level, that it caused us to think about, you know, well, what's next? So we're going to move now into talking about, you know, a little bit more practical view of things. So I think Dave, talk to us a little bit about what Brandon Hall has seen, just in terms of, more recent impact.
Yeah, and this, it definitely influences how we move forward on this, right? And that the pandemic had this impact of cuts in a lot of areas. We've got half of companies said that there were some sort of cuts made to L&D as a direct result of the pandemic, some more significant than others, but it's happened all across the organization. So, not too surprising that it would happen in L&D as well. And, I think those of you that are L&D professionals, you know that very often, almost any kind of change, you sort of brace yourselves and wait for that moment when you hear that there's going to be less budget for learning as things move forward. But at the same time, as all of this is going on, as organizations navigate their way through this pandemic, the strategic profile of L&D has risen dramatically. It's seen as a key player in this change. Like, how do we upskill and reskill people to meet the needs that are presented to us? We can't just simply hire a bunch of new people, right? There has to be a lot of development and fast. And so what we saw is you got a significant portion, 48% of companies nearly half, say that we've got more visibility in decision making. And then even on top of that, beyond that, another 13% go even further and say we're more closely integrated with the C-suite than ever before. So you've got this dichotomy of, at the same time that there are cuts and impacts, some somewhat negative impacts, there's this elevation of strategic profile. And so it's really sort of a perfect storm of maybe something that you all on the call today have been talking about for years, is doing more with less, right? I mean, that's always sort of been the mantra. Well, it's never been more real than now. The less is pretty black and white, and the more is actually, I think, probably more dramatic than it's been in the past. So it's on the one hand, it can be, daunting to look at this, but the other side, I think, is it's an opportunity, right? I think we need to seize on this opportunity of strategic profile in the organizations.
Dave, what's important to me as I look at this data point is, in the past year, you look at moderate impact plus the significant impact, you're at what, 61%? That are now in that kind of a position, whereas you look at what we probably were before. I mean, I would bet these same results from a year ago, and that percent increase up to the 61% is probably pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I would agree with that, yes.
So with this being the case, how do we start thinking about enabling a workforce? We've got our Conduent point of view on the framework for doing it, and it's built around 3 principles: interact, perform, and adapt. Interact is probably intuitive. I mean, it's largely going to be technology enabled. It's a lot of the intentional social teams, self-directed kind of interactions that take place and need to take place. Certainly it was very important during the pandemic last year when everybody was virtual, but the fact of the matter is it had a level of importance even prior to that. And for those organizations who continue to keep some portion or some period of time where the workforce is remote, it will continue to have significance. Then you look at adapt, and adapt again is all about change. You'll see that 3 of the 4 sources of content sit over here, mainly because they're key importance when you get into particularly a learning environment, and what we need to do to enable a workforce to perform is all driven by change. Anytime you have something new or more that needs to be shared, whether it's a direct communication or something new with product or service or policy change, what have you, that requires some level of reaction and adaptation to it. And then perform, this touches on some of the things that I had previously talked about on the future of work slide, but what's added in here are more the classic HR technologies and programs. And the reason that these are important is What you don't ever want to see, and I think many of us probably have seen it in the past, is where you're trying to go through some sort of an effort, particularly if it involves a certain type of change, and you're trying to get people's actions and behaviors to be different than what they have been. And you've got a misaligned program. The easiest one to point to is some sort of an incentive comp program that actually incents a different kind of actions and behaviors. And then after the fact, you're wondering why our efforts, whether they were so well planned out and what have you, why aren't they successful? Why can't we do it? And it's because of this misalignment. So it's that need to look across everything that you've got in place to enable your workforce to make sure that you do have, again, those right kind of alignments. And then you'll note on the bottom that we're, again, looking at dynamic content management and curation. So it's not all new creation. There's certainly existing content that can be curated. I also wanted to point out, since I'd mentioned it before, you'll see the definition of the workforce difference. Workforce is no longer, as it had been in the past, just employees. It is your employee group, but it's also contingent workers and any sort of third party who may be very active as a part of executing against your business strategy. But for the remainder of our conversation, we're going to focus on learning in particular, formal learning, informal learning, workflow learning, and I talked a little bit about what the curated means. So this is a really interesting slide. One of my dear associates from a third-party partner took a lot of what we had been talking about it and created this visual graphic. What this slide is showing is that on average, you've got, let's just call it, for argument's sake, 47 weeks out of the year that you're actually going to be working on more of a full-time basis. And during each of those weeks, there are 5 working days and, call it 8 hours per day. So in this period of time, you are fulfilling your responsibilities, meeting expectation to perform in the flow of work. Then we throw in learning, and classically what's happened is that you had a learning day, or maybe it's 2 days in a row. Sometimes it's a week in a row, depending upon the need and the nature of the learning. But usually those learning events were interspersed throughout the year. And oh, by the way, when you were doing it, you were stepping away from the work while you did it. Then you throw in a little bit more of the ad hoc, sometimes, compliance-based learning or what have you, that needs to happen. You need to fit it in, ad hoc things that come up where, something you couldn't have anticipated into some sort of a beginning of the year learning plan you have to incorporate. But again, you see that it's somewhat fragmented, and sometimes one thing relates to another, sometimes it doesn't. You've got still the challenge around the learning events themselves being interspersed. And so when you've got this kind of a balance, does this make sense in the long term to enable a workforce to perform? Especially when a workforce who needs to perform spends on average, and this is coming out of a McKinsey study, 1 day a week doing something to figure out what they need to do to perform. Pretty compelling and dramatic and probably even unexpected outcome. But when you think about the number of times people will go and Google something or YouTube it or, ping someone or wait until a supervisor or other manager is available, or, whether you need subject matter expertise from someone else in your organization, that you're stopping to try to find what you need to do that's relevant to what you need to do. And so this amount of time that is, between all of these events and then trying to fill it with the sourcing on your own, the information that you need, is creating much more of a challenge. And so is this the best way that we should go about it? Is this the best we can do? So I think, there are ways that you can start to mitigate that. And in this slide, Dave will talk a little bit more about some of the approaches that have been really in action for a good period of time.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that organizations were sort of headed in this direction for the most part anyway, trying to broaden the number of modalities and tools and experiences they provide to their learners. I will say that the pandemic environment accelerated that transition pretty rapidly, as we suddenly had to move from what was usually a pretty in-person, face-to-face based learning into completely digital, in a very short period of time. But the key here is it's not just about meeting the needs of a remote workforce, which won't be around forever. It's already shifting back. These are the kinds of things that companies should be doing for other reasons, not just simply efficiency of the workforce. It's about driving impact, which is what we're talking about. So in our study, we asked organizations, does your learning approach positively impact the following outcomes? And we've got things like time to proficiency or productivity, you've got employee engagement, you've got individual performance, voluntary turnover, right? So is your learning positively impacting these? And it was on a 5-point scale. So we looked at companies that said, yes, they're strongly 4 or 5 having a positive impact on those outcomes, versus those companies that weren't having as strong an impact on those outcomes. And they said, okay, what are they doing differently? And we find that those high impact companies are far more likely to use these kinds of learning tools more regularly or consistently. So everything from video to coaching, informal, you can see the list and the gaps where, it's not necessarily direct causation, but there's clearly a correlation here with these companies that say, we're doing these things, and we're also telling you that our approach is having a positive impact on some key outcomes. So that's really what you're after, is this idea of, okay, high impact learning, here it is. It has this kind of look. These are the characteristics. This is the DNA.
That's great. So let me try to bring it all together. What you'll see on this slide is a concept around train, transfer, and sustain. And so that's probably not completely new to many of you out there. But what has classically happened in the past is that the focus has been, from an L&D perspective, on delivering training. We get a request that comes in from a business area saying, hey, I think I need, 1 classroom training. We can do something else virtually. There'll be some pre-work that, we'd like to have somebody read this. And, maybe there's an e-learning that we want to follow. And so the focus has been on the development of those training deliverables themselves. And what happens in that is that if you only focus on the deliverable itself, it's great from the point in time that you are completing the training, and particularly where you're stepping away from the workflow and you're doing formal training. So whether it's, some type of virtual or physical classroom or an e-learning that you're doing, you're having the kind of impact that you want for the short term after it. But you'll see that red bar, and most of you are familiar with the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. That's representative of what happens if the right kind of either regularity or support is not in place for someone to use all of the knowledge that they've gained during some sort of a formal training. They forget. It's only natural, right? So what we're trying to do is, how do we better fill that curve so that we can enable transferring the knowledge so it can be applied to job responsibilities that each of the workers have, so that you're able to perform, and not just perform in order to sustain, but to move into continuous improvement from that as well. So the approach that we at Conduent are advocating is this balanced approach. So targeted training is what I just described. It's largely going to be your classroom, virtual or physical, e-learning, any type of training where you have to step away from work to actually do it. It will be also the combination of intentional, informal training. So some of what Dave was talking about on the previous slide. So, like micro-learning, for example, or coaching. Much of that happens away from the workflow itself as opposed to while you're doing it. All of it is still important. We're not saying walk away from it. What we're saying is add another element. Add digital support in the workflow itself that is relevant and contextual to the task or activity that needs to happen, that you need someone to take action upon. That way, where it's something that is not just absolutely critical to what someone needs to know. So, the part of the reason that your formal training is important is anytime you learn something brand new, or you need to know more about what's new, what you need to do is step away from the workflow to take the time to do that. But there are certain kinds of things that you would learn in that formal setting that rather than risking forgetting about it and causing, quality issues, errors, frustration with your workforce because they have to search and try to find what it is that they need to be able to do, that you balance that with some sort of digital support in the workflow itself. So while someone is working, and when you put all of these pieces together in a balanced approach between formal, informal, and where informal is the combination of intentional informal plus, and by intentional informal, I mean this digital support, plus the unintentional informal, you then get to a much better place where you're able to support the kind of performance that you want and need from the workforce itself. So let me stop just real quick before I go to the last slide here. Dave, any questions that we need to address, because the final wrapper is kind of the why.
Sure. It was back earlier in some of the, you were talking about where high-performing companies are going next, right? So critical concepts of future enablement. One of them was promoting digital fluency. And so Sandy was just wondering, how do you define digital fluency?
It's, think back to all of the new types of technologies that any company would incorporate into their operations and into the way in which they enable someone to work. So it's getting the workforce adapted to, comfortable with, and going through a formal adoption of those enabling technologies.
Yeah, and I think it's a key piece, because we see it recently in our work on upskilling and reskilling, which is clearly what companies are focused on right now. And a big part of that is the personalization of learning at scale. And one of the things that we've been seeing and that we've been advising companies to take into consideration as they build these kind of environments is the understanding this current state of digital fluency among their learners. It's very difficult to personalize and contextualize learning if you don't have a good handle on what the wants, needs, and limitations of your learning audiences are.
Right.
So, yeah, so it's understanding what the digital fluency is, getting a good baseline for that, and then working towards improving that moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard, commentary about generational differences, but you've got preferences in there, and then you've just got the classic issue around change management. All you need is a group of folks to be passively resistant, and you've undermined all of your efforts.
Precisely. And then
let me
flip. Yeah,
let me do. I'm sorry. I was thinking there might have been a question about some of the things so before we go further back, let me just kind of close with this slide, and I probably should have just gone to this one. Here's the why, everyone. what we've seen by what we Conduent have done and what we've done in conjunction with the business partnership that we've got with Apply Synergies, who are the creators of the 5 moments of need methodology. As you heard me talk, for those of you who are familiar with 5 moments of need, you probably recognized a lot of the sound bites that I was sharing. Conduent Learning Solutions and Apply Synergies actually have a business partnership where we have an ongoing teaming. Conduent is the exclusive preferred affiliate, and preferred affiliate has a specific defined meaning to it that talks about what we do and how we work together. And collectively, through our individual and combined efforts with what we're doing, we're seeing similar outcomes. You know, when you adopt the kind of balanced approach that I just talked about, you're improving the learner experience. So I'm starting down there on the lower left corner. And what that's doing from a result and outcomes perspective is we're seeing anywhere from 20 to even up to 50% less time to onboard. And in the 30 to 50% faster time to proficiency, or getting to a more proficient workforce. Go up to like the 11 o'clock position, the reduced support. We're seeing anywhere from 50 to 60% less time needed to tap the shoulder of your supervisor or manager, or going to some sort of an internal expert to ask questions that you may have. Because look at 12 o'clock, the efficiency and time savings. When you use some sort of digital support in the flow of work, it provides the answers that are needed to at least 50% of the questions that most workers would ask. Again, back to what I previously said, you are improving quality by reducing error rates, which is going to improve upon outcomes. And one of the side benefits, although it may not, it's not the primary in this, if you're reducing the amount of time that you're spending in training away from the workflow, because you're enabling a lot of that to happen while someone's working, you're also reducing your training costs. And then in the last, what we've just been talking about is where you're putting that support in the flow of work itself. Think about what we're just talking about with digital fluency and going through adoption of new technologies, new processes. When you provide this type of support, the change adoption becomes inherent in the workflow itself. It becomes part of the new workflow because you're providing that support while someone's working, so they're not looking for it and going back to, a peer or a colleague who may go back to, tribal knowledge, legacy, what's always been done. We've always done it this way. And so it inherently assists to move along for change management. So those are pretty significant business outcomes that we see. And one of the reasons why this approach has just made business sense to us right from the beginning. All right, Dave, I think we've got a little bit of time for questions even at the end.
Yes, we do. One of those that came in is, you had mentioned enabling technology. And I think sort of in the discussion of the last couple of slides, you touched on it some more, but the question had come in, like, what would be an example of an enabling technology?
Yeah, so let me just talk about the example I just gave with, you're implementing a new technology or even an existing technology. Think about Salesforce. Most companies or many companies use Salesforce or a similar CRM. And the information that you get, the training that you get, the support that you get is good to a point, but it may not be completely sufficient for someone who is trying to complete a task. And so there are technologies such as WalkMe that you can use as part of digital adoption. It's a platform that supports that digital adoption. And another technology would be an electronic performance support system. And there's several suppliers out there who provide that type of technology support for different process-based reasons. There's another one that I'm looking at right now, but it's a little early to talk too much about, but it's intriguing to me because what it's doing is using technology that incorporates AI to provide support for, rather than process, judgment-based decisions that need to be made. So, stay tuned as we further explore that one. Maybe there'll be more to come on that as a topic.
Great. Thank you for that. And then another thing that came up, you had mentioned, we were talking unintentional learning. Maybe give a little more clarity around that, because I think David was saying in his mind, whatever we're attempting to do should be intentional. So just talk a little bit about what you mean by unintentional learning.
Unintentional is something that is not thought about and planned, but happens incidentally. So, going to your peer, your colleague, whether you're in an office, back in an office location, and you're, sticking your head over the cubicle, or pinging somebody on, Teams or Skype, or, whatever your flavor of technology happens to be, that would be unintentional support. Are you learning? Absolutely. And is it going to happen? Absolutely. But was it planned and intentional in the beginning? No.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that. That helps very much. So, yeah, and so please, if anybody else has other questions, we've tried to get through them as they came in. So if there are more, please feel free to ask those questions. We do our research, Deb, and ask companies, what's going to be happening. But like I said, this has been evolving so quickly with a lot of uncertainty. I'm just curious, as you talk to and work with companies that are going through these changes, what do you see sort of happening more, I guess, short term for that return to work strategy, as far as these? Because I think what's coming up a lot of times now in people's minds is this hybrid model that they're going to have to manage. And how do you see people wrapping their heads around and doing all of these things that you're talking about with that added layer of complexity?
Yeah, exactly. It's not going to be the same, set of facts and circumstances for each organization. But I think if you start with looking at it through a different lens of what do we need to do in order to enable performance? Where are our strengths with that right now? Where are our weaknesses? Where are the gaps that we can fill, and how do we need to start filling those gaps? I think that a strategy and approach starts to emerge. Where you don't start, and this is, I see this time and time again, because there's a cool new technology that's out there, and it becomes the bright shiny penny. And this is meant as no offense to any technology supplier out there, certainly none. But where you lead with that versus a strategy that says, here's what we want and need to do, and here's what we need to do to enable that, I don't think you always get to the right answer. Maybe sometimes it does happen, but is it the right long-term answer that you intended to does it get you to the right place to solve the problem you intended to solve?
Right. Yeah, I think that's key. I think that there is going to be a need to figure out how to synchronously connect people better from a learning perspective. There's a lot of tools out there from a sort of productivity perspective, but synchronously connect people who are remote and in the office. I mean, I think for some organizations the difference doesn't change much, because even though people are back in the office itself, they might still be working separately at their own desks and what have you, and maybe not have everybody together in a place. But when you do have those kind of events, how do we incorporate those remote workers without having to fly everybody in? I think is an important piece. So Pam asked an interesting question.
Here's one of the other benefits, Dave, that I see. Let me throw this out. I've got to comment on it. Certainly in the past year, overall wellness has become much, much more critical and much more of a, strategic priority than it ever has been in the past. And so that's one of the benefits that I see from adopting a more balanced approach. If you are able to do much more support that used to be, learning away from the workflow, do it in the workflow itself, that potentially gives you more time to focus on other needs that the workforce has. And if the cost of learning is down a bit, the investment dollars perhaps to put into those kind of initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
So that, oh, go ahead, Dave.
No, let's finish the thought because I was going to move on to another question. I just want to make sure you're.
Nope, I'm done with that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so Pam asked, and this is a question we get a lot, about how frequently do you recommend that digital learning be spaced out over time, right? And I'll let you sort of answer in a little more detail, but to me, I get asked this a lot, comes up in our member center quite a bit, and there isn't a formula, there isn't a specific answer. It really comes about, and this gets into all these other sort of models that we use about how to create the learning experience based on, the desired outcomes, the learning audience, the learning outcomes. You put this all together and figure out what should that look like, and that's what determines that. So is it monthly, weekly, daily? Well, that depends on what your goals are and what will make the most sense. I mean, there are certain things that aren't going to require a daily check-in, right? But then there's other things where that doing it every month, it's going to be like you're starting over from scratch every time. So unfortunately, in my mind, I don't have like a rule of thumb or, you say do this, but you look at the things that go into it. And I was going to have Deb, maybe you've got some better, more granular thoughts.
Yeah, here's one more thing to add to it. And this helps to drive, I think, what you do, how much of it that you do, and how frequently you do it. And it all has to deal with the level of criticality of business impact. If it is something that without having that kind of set aside time to learn and practice, for example, if you have a workforce who has not gone through the type of learning that they need to, and you just allow them to try to find their own way, and you have critical business impact to it, something in the strategy is not correct. And so that's where this notion around type and level of criticality of business impact has got to be assessed on the front end so that you determine where that needs to fit as part of a more formalized learning plan versus what you can do in those other balanced ways that we talked about.
Great. All right. Thank you for that. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight into that. Sorry, it couldn't be, I always feel bad when my answers tend to be more philosophical than just do it daily. And that's the answer. Because nothing's ever that easy, or else none of us would be doing this. So I appreciate that question a lot, Pam. I'm glad we could share it with you, and as well, I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds. Like I said, we get asked that quite a bit. So thank you for that. So yeah, we've done it and managed to reach the end here and answer all the questions that came in. So really, group, can't thank you enough for asking questions and engaging with us. I'd like to thank Conduent, obviously, for allowing us to put this on, and of course providing Debbie and her time and insights to answer those questions and to give a breakdown of where things are headed and where they should be headed. So Debbie, as always, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Dave. It's always great to have a chance to facilitate with you. To all of those who participated in today's session, thank you very much for your time. Certainly feel free to reach out if you have any follow-on questions or would like additional information or clarification about what we talked about today.
Great. Awesome, everybody. Thank you so much. We'll see you on another webinar. Thank you.